Jake Sullivan stood on the bridge of his ship watching the alien fleet move closer to Earth, and he knew this day would change everything for his people forever because the Zephyrian Empire had come with their massive ships and strange weapons, demanding that humans surrender their world without any fight at all. But Jake and his crew had different ideas about what surrender meant to them and their families. Back home on the blue planet below, the aliens had been talking to Earth leaders for 3 months now, and their message was always the same, which was that humans should give up their planet and become workers for the Empire, because a terrible enemy called the Void Collective was coming to destroy everything in this part of space, and the Zephyrians needed Earth as a base to fight them, but humans were not the type to just hand over their home without getting something good in return for it. Admiral Lisa Martinez had been working day and night with the alien commanders, trying to find a way for both sides to get what they needed, and she finally came up with an idea that shocked everyone, including the tall blue-skinned Zephyrians, who thought humans were too weak and stupid to be real partners in any kind of war against such a deadly enemy as the Collective. But Lisa knew her people better than any alien ever could. She told the Zephyrian High Command that humans would fight alongside them against the Void Collective, but only as equals, not as slaves or servants, and that Earth would remain human territory while serving as a base for joint operations against their common enemy, and this deal would give the aliens what they needed while keeping human freedom intact, which was the most important thing of all to every person on Earth. Captain Ryan Brooks was one of the first humans to work directly with Zephyrian technology, and he spent weeks learning how their weapons and ships work so he could teach other human engineers how to upgrade their own vessels with alien systems that were far more advanced than anything Earth had ever built before. But Ryan found that human creativity helped him understand the technology in ways that surprised his alien teachers. Dr. Amy Foster led teams of scientists who studied every piece of Zephyrian equipment they could get their hands on, and she discovered that while the aliens were much more advanced in pure science and engineering, they lacked the human ability to think outside normal patterns and find new solutions to old problems, which made her realize that this partnership might work better than anyone expected it. The first real test came when both human and Zephyrian forces had to work together on a mission to attack a Void Collective mining operation in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, and Lieutenant Ben Parker was chosen to lead a squadron of human fighters that would fly alongside alien pilots who had been fighting the Collective for many years. Already Ben felt nervous as he climbed into his newly upgraded fighter, because the weapon systems were completely different from anything he had trained on, and the aliens had made it clear that they expected humans to follow orders without question and stay out of the way when real fighting started. But Ben and his pilots had other ideas about how this battle should go. When the combined fleet reached the asteroid belt, they found that the Void Collective had built a massive mining station that was protected by ships unlike anything humans had ever seen before, with dark metal hulls that seemed to absorb light and weapons that fired beams of pure energy that could cut through the strongest armor like it was paper thin. The Zephyrian commanders ordered their ships to attack in the traditional formation they had used for decades, but the Collective forces responded with tactics that seemed to predict every move the aliens would make, and soon the battle was going very badly for the combined fleet, with several ships already destroyed and more taking heavy damage every minute. Ben saw that the alien battle plan was not working, and he made a decision that would either save the mission or get him court-martialed. When they returned to Earth, because he broke formation and led his human fighters on a completely different approach that used the asteroids as cover while they moved closer to the enemy station, his pilots followed him without question, even though they knew they were disobeying direct orders from their alien commanders, and they used their smaller, faster ships to dart between the massive space rocks while firing their weapons at weak points in the station defenses that the bigger Zephyrian ships could not reach from their positions. The surprise attack worked better than anyone hoped, and the human fighters managed to disable several key systems on the Collective station, which allowed the Zephyrian heavy cruisers to move in and finish the job with their powerful main guns. But the victory came at a cost, because 2 human pilots were lost when their ships were Destroyed by enemy fire after the battle, the Zephyrian commanders were angry about humans breaking formation, but they could not argue with the results because the mission had succeeded only because of the unexpected tactics that Ben and his pilots had used, and this made them start to think that maybe humans could be more useful partners than they had first believed. Jake Sullivan received the battle report while his ship was still patrolling near Earth, and he knew that this small victory was just the beginning of a much larger war that would test humanity in ways they had never been tested before, but he also felt proud that his people had already shown they could fight alongside aliens and find ways to win even when the odds were against them. 6 months after the first battle, Colonel Steve Williams found himself leading a mixed group of human soldiers and Zephyrian warriors on the surface of a dead planet where the Void Collective had built a fortress that controlled 3 star systems. And everyone knew this mission would be much harder than the asteroid belt fight because ground combat was different from space battles in ways that could get everyone killed. The collective stronghold was built into the side of a mountain and protected by energy shields that could stop any normal attack, but the Zephyrian generals had a plan that involved sending waves of soldiers directly at the main entrance while heavy weapons tried to break through the barriers from long distance. And Steve could see right away that this plan would cost too many lives without much chance of success. He tried to explain to the alien commanders that humans had learned different ways to fight on the ground during their own wars, and that sometimes the best approach was not the most obvious one, but the Zephyrians believed their methods had worked for centuries, and they did not want to listen to advice from a species that had only been fighting in space for less than a year. Claire Adams was working in a temporary laboratory that had been set up near the landing zone, and she was studying pieces of collective technology that previous missions had captured, and she noticed something strange about how their energy systems worked compared to what Zephyrian science said was possible, and this discovery would change everything about how the war was fought. While the generals argued about tactics, Claire realized that collective energy matrices operated on principles that were completely different from both human and Zephyrian understanding, and instead of trying to overpower their shields, maybe they could find a way to make the shields turn off by themselves if they understood the right frequency patterns to use against them. She worked for 3 days straight without sleeping while the attack force prepared for what everyone expected to be a very bloody assault, and finally she found the answer hidden in mathematical relationships that no one had thought to look for before, because they were based on quantum mechanics that worked differently in this part of the galaxy. Meanwhile, Sergeant Tony Clark was training with Zephyrian soldiers and learning their weapons and tactics, but he also taught them some human methods for moving quietly and striking fast without being detected, and he found that when you combined alien technology with human creativity, you could do things that neither side could accomplish alone. The attack began at dawn on the 4th day, and the Zephyrian forces moved forward in their traditional formation, expecting to fight their way through multiple defensive lines before reaching the main fortress, but Steve had convinced some of the commanders to let his human units try a different approach that might work better than the frontal assault while the aliens attacked from the front. Steve led his soldiers around the side of the mountain using climbing gear and explosives to create their own path through areas that the collective had not bothered to defend because they seemed impossible to cross, and this move put the humans in position to attack the fortress from an unexpected direction. At the same time, Claire finished building a device that could broadcast the frequency patterns she had discovered, and when she activated it, the collective shields began to flicker and weaken just as Steve and his team reached the rear entrance of the stronghold and found that their weapons could now damage the walls and doors that had been protected before. Tony Clark was with the main Zephyrian force when the shields failed, and he immediately organized a combined assault that used both human speed and alien firepower to break through the defenses faster than anyone thought possible, and within hours they had captured the entire fortress with fewer casualties than the most optimistic predictions. The victory at the mountain fortress proved to the Zephyrian High Command that human ideas about warfare could be just as valuable as their advanced technology, and they began to ask human officers for advice on other missions. Instead of just expecting them to follow orders without question like they had done before Captain Danny Rogers was commanding. A supply ship called the Liberty when his crew detected a massive collective fleet moving toward Kepler Station, which was an important refueling base that both humans and Zephyrians needed to keep their ships operating in this region of space. And Danny knew that if the station fell, it would be much harder to continue fighting the war. The enemy fleet was too big for the small group of ships that were protecting Kepler Station, and everyone could see that this battle would be lost unless something unexpected happened to change the odds. But Danny and his crew were not the type to give up just because the situation looked impossible to win. When the collective ships arrived, they began attacking with weapons that were more powerful than anything the defenders had seen before, and within minutes, the station lost its main power systems and half of its defensive guns were destroyed. But the human and Zephyrian crews kept fighting even though their situation was getting worse. Every second Danny watched his friends die as ship after ship was destroyed by enemy fire, and he realized that conventional tactics would not save anyone, so he made a decision that shocked everyone, including his own crew, because he turned his supply ship toward the largest collective vessel and began accelerating directly at it like he was planning to ram the enemy ship. His crew thought he had lost his mind until he explained that their cargo hold was full of mining explosives that were supposed to be delivered to the asteroid belt, and if they could get close enough to the enemy dreadnought, they might be able to damage it badly enough to give the other defenders a chance to escape, or even win the battle. The Liberty was not a warship, and it had no real weapons or armor, but it was fast, and Danny used every trick he had learned about flying in asteroid fields to avoid the enemy fire as he got closer and closer to his target, while his crew prepared the explosives for detonation when they made contact with the collective vessel. Ramming attack worked better than anyone dared to hope, and the explosion not only destroyed the enemy dreadnought but also damaged two other collective ships badly enough that the remaining defenders were able to drive off the rest of the attacking fleet and save Kepler Station from capture. After the battle, the Zephyrian officers could not understand why Danny and his crew had been willing to sacrifice their lives for a tactical advantage, and this was when they began to realize that humans approached warfare with a level of commitment that their own people had never shown in all their centuries of fighting. 2 years into the war, General Kevin Murphy had become something that nobody expected when the fighting first started, because he was now commanding fleets that included ships from both Earth and the Zephyrian Empire, and his strategies were winning battles that everyone thought would be impossible to win, and the aliens had learned to trust human judgment when everything seemed hopeless. The collective had been pushed back from 12-star systems, and their advance toward the core worlds had been stopped completely, but Kevin knew that the real test was still coming, because intelligence reports showed that the enemy was building new types of ships with weapons that could destroy entire planets, and everyone understood that this war was about to become much more dangerous for both sides. Dr. Linda Taylor was working in the main research facility on Luna, where she led a team of human and Zephyrian scientists who were trying to understand how the collective managed to coordinate their forces across such vast distances without any delays in communication, and this mystery had puzzled military commanders since the war began because their response times were impossibly fast. She discovered that the enemy used a form of quantum entanglement that connected every collective ship and soldier through something like a shared mind that allowed them to act as one giant organism instead of separate units, and this explained why their tactics were so effective and why conventional strategies often failed against them. Linda realized that if they could find a way to disrupt this quantum network, the collective forces would lose their main advantage and become vulnerable to the kind of individual thinking and creativity that humans and Zephyrians excelled at. But developing such a weapon would require combining human innovation with alien technology in ways that had never been tried before. Engineer Marcus Webb was designing new ship configurations at the orbital shipyards above Earth, and he had been experimenting with ways to make human vessels more effective in combat by changing their basic structure to take advantage of human strengths like speed and maneuverability while minimizing weaknesses like limited firepower compared to larger alien ships. His new designs used multiple smaller ships working together instead of single, large vessels, and this approach allowed human crews to use their natural teamwork and communication skills to create flexible formations that could adapt to changing battle conditions faster than traditional fleets could respond. Captain Holly Green was chosen to test these new tactics during the mission to liberate the Zephyrian homeworld, which had been under collective occupation for almost 3 years and was considered one of the most heavily defended targets in known space because the enemy had turned the entire planet into a fortress with orbital weapons platforms and thousands of ships protecting it. The Zephyrian High Command wanted to use a massive frontal assault with every available ship because their homeworld was too important to approach with anything less than overwhelming force, but Holly convinced them to try a different strategy that would use the environment itself as a weapon against the collective defenders. She studied the star system around the Zephyrian homeworld and noticed that it contained several asteroid belts and gas giants with strong gravity fields that could be used to hide attacking ships and create unexpected approach routes that the enemy would not be watching for because they seemed too dangerous for normal navigation. Holly divided her fleet into small groups that approached the planet from 12 different directions using asteroid fields and gravity wells to mask their movements, and when all the groups were in position, they began their attack simultaneously from angles that the collective had not prepared to defend against the liberation. Battle lasted for 18 hours and became famous throughout the galaxy because it was the first time that collective forces had been completely defeated on a world they had occupied for more than a few months, and the victory proved that human tactical thinking could overcome even the most advanced enemy defenses when combined with alien technology during the fighting. Holly used tactics that were so unexpected that the collective commanders could not adapt fast enough to counter them, and she turned gas giant storms into shields for her ships while using asteroid impacts as artillery strikes against enemy positions on the planet's surface. The most amazing part of the battle happened when Holly realized that the collective orbital platforms were positioned to defend against attacks from space, but not from attacks that came up from the planet itself. So she sent a group of ships down into the atmosphere where they could strike the platforms from below using the planet gravity. To accelerate their weapons after the Zephyrian homeworld was liberated, the alien government offered to make Kevin Murphy a full admiral in their fleet, which was an honor that had never been given to any non-Zephyrian in their entire history, but Kevin said he would only accept the rank if other humans were also promoted to leadership positions throughout the combined forces. This decision showed the Zephyrians that humans were not interested in personal glory, but wanted to help both species become stronger together, and it marked the beginning of true partnership between Earth and the Empire instead of the unequal alliance that had existed before the war. Was no longer about human survival or proving that Earth deserved to exist, because now it had become a fight that humans were actively winning through their refusal to accept defeat and their ability to find solutions that nobody else could see, and the galaxy was starting to understand that something special was happening with this young species. Intelligence reports from the front lines showed that collective forces were beginning to retreat from systems they had held for decades, and their advance had been stopped completely in some sectors where human commanders were leading the defense, and this change in the war situation was something that no one had expected. When the fighting first started, the Zephyrian Emperor sent a personal message to Earth thanking humanity for their service and acknowledging that the war would have been lost already if humans had not joined the fight. With their unique approach to solving impossible problems and their willingness to sacrifice everything for victory, Kevin Murphy read the message while standing on the bridge of his flagship, and he knew that the hardest fighting was still ahead because the collective would not give up easily, and they would probably try something desperate to turn the war back in their favor, but he also knew that humans had proven they could handle whatever challenges came next. Major Sam Rodriguez had been a prisoner of the Void Collective for 4 months now, and every day they tried new methods to break his mind and make him reveal the location of human military bases and the details of Alliance battle plans, but Sam and his team had decided from the first day of their capture that they would die before giving the enemy information that could hurt their people. The collective interrogators were confused by human behavior because in their experience most species would eventually cooperate when faced with enough pain and suffering, but humans seemed to become more stubborn and determined the worse their treatment became. And this was something that the enemy had never encountered in all their years of conquest across the galaxy. Dr. Nicole Davis was coordinating relief efforts on New Boston, which was a civilian colony world that had been under siege by collective forces for 6 weeks, and the enemy had cut off all supply lines, hoping to starve the population into surrender. But Nicole and the colonists had turned their entire city into a fortress where every person contributed to the defense effort. The siege tactics that worked against other species were failing completely against humans. Because instead of becoming demoralized and demanding surrender, the civilians had organized themselves into fighting units that made every street and building into a weapon that could be used against the invaders, and this transformation amazed the Zephyrian observers who had never seen anything like it. Carl Johnson had been a factory worker before the war started, but when the collective attacked his homeworld, he became a resistance leader who taught ordinary people how to fight against enemies with superior technology and weapons, and his methods spread to other worlds where humans refused to accept occupation. The collective had expected that targeting civilian populations would break human morale and force their military to negotiate for peace, but instead these attacks awakened something in humanity that made them fight harder and with more determination than anyone thought possible, and every human in the galaxy became a potential soldier when their families were threatened. Admiral Peter Kim received orders to defend New Geneva, which was the most important shipyard in Alliance space and where most of the new ships were being built for the combined fleet, but intelligence reports showed that the collective was sending their largest force ever assembled to destroy the facility and capture the advanced technology being developed there. Peter knew that his fleet was outnumbered by more than 5 to 1, and that conventional defensive tactics would not be enough to save the shipyard, but he also knew that humans had developed a reputation for finding ways to win battles that seemed impossible, and he was determined to live up to that reputation. The collective attack force arrived in the New Geneva system with enough firepower to destroy 12 planets, and their commanders expected to overwhelm the defenses within hours, but Peter had spent weeks preparing surprises that would turn every piece of the shipyard infrastructure into a weapon that could be used against the invaders. When the battle began, Peter ordered his ships to fall back toward the shipyard, which made the collective commanders think that the humans were retreating in panic, but this was actually part of a plan that would use the orbital facilities themselves as the main weapons in the fight. The shipyard had massive construction platforms that were designed to build the largest warships, and Peter had loaded these platforms with explosives and programmed them to ram into enemy vessels, while his fleet used the confusion to attack from unexpected angles, and this tactic worked so well that the collective lost dozens of ships in the first hour. During the 3-week siege that followed, Peter showed the galaxy what human determination really meant, because he refused to evacuate even when his defenses were failing and his ships were running out of ammunition, and instead of retreating, he ordered his crews to strip weapons from damaged vessels and install them on construction equipment and mining ships. The most famous moment of the siege came when Peter himself took command of a cargo hauler that had been converted into a makeshift warship and led a desperate attack against the collective dreadnought that was preparing to destroy the main shipyard platform, and even though his ship was destroyed in the attack, he managed to damage the enemy vessel enough that other defenders could finish it off. The siege ended when reinforcements arrived from Earth and the Zephyrian core worlds, but by that time, Peter and his defenders had already proven that humans would literally fight with their bare hands, rather than surrender something important to their people, and this display of absolute commitment shocked both allies and enemies. After the battle, Zephyrian military analysts studied the human defensive tactics and realized that what they had witnessed was not just good strategy, but a completely different approach to warfare. That was based on the idea that some things were worth dying for, and that surrender was simply not an option under any circumstances. The collective high command began to understand that they were facing an enemy unlike any they had conquered before. Because humans seemed to become stronger and more dangerous when they were losing rather than weaker and more willing to negotiate, and this realization forced them to completely reconsider their strategy for winning the war on dozens of worlds. Across human space, civilians were organizing into militias and learning how to fight because they had seen what happened to colonies that were captured by the collective, and they decided that death was better than slavery. And this attitude spread to other species who began to copy human methods of total resistance. The psychological impact of human behavior was starting to affect collective morale because their soldiers had been taught that all organic species would eventually submit to superior force, but humans proved that this assumption was wrong, and some enemies would fight forever rather than give up their freedom. Sam Rodriguez finally escaped from his prison when a rescue mission led by Captain Holly Green managed to infiltrate the collective detention facility, and during his debriefing, he reported that the enemy interrogators had been frustrated and confused by human resistance because they could not understand why anyone would choose death over cooperation. The intelligence that Sam and his team had protected during their months of captivity proved to be crucial for planning the next phase of the war because it included details about collective weaknesses that could only be discovered by someone who had been inside their facilities and seen how their systems actually worked. 5 years into the war, the Void Collective decided to end the conflict once and for all by launching the largest military operation in galactic history, and their target was Earth itself because they believed that destroying the human homeworld would finally break the spirit of the species that had caused them so much trouble and turned what should have been an easy conquest into a nightmare that lasted longer than any previous campaign. Commander Alex Turner was patrolling the outer rim when he received the emergency broadcast that every human in space had been waiting for and dreading since the war began, because the message was simple and terrifying, which was that thousands of collective ships were heading directly toward Earth, and every available vessel needed to return home immediately to defend the planet where humanity had first learned to dream of reaching the stars. The response to the Earth emergency call was something that amazed even the humans themselves, because every single human ship in space immediately abandoned whatever mission they were on and turned toward home, regardless of orders from Alliance Command or their current tactical situation. And this mass movement of vessels created the largest rescue fleet that had ever been assembled by any species in known history. Alex was commanding a group of damaged ships that had been returning from a deep space mission when the call came, and even though his vessels were low on fuel and some of them could barely maintain life support, he ordered the entire group to make best speed for Earth, because nothing else mattered compared to protecting the world that had given birth to their civilization on Earth itself. President Kate Miller was coordinating the planetary defense with a determination that inspired everyone who worked with her, because she had decided that if the collective wanted to take the human homeworld, they would have to fight for every city and every building and every street until there was nothing left but rubble and the memory of a people who would not surrender. The attack on Earth began 3 days after the emergency call went out, and the collective arrived with enough firepower to destroy the planet 10 times over, but they had made a critical mistake in their planning because they assumed that humans would react to overwhelming force, the same way that other species had reacted in similar situations throughout their history of conquest. Instead of panic and demands for negotiated surrender, the collective found themselves facing a defense that was unlike anything they had ever encountered, because every human on Earth had become a soldier, and every building had become a fortress, and every street had become a battlefield where the invaders would have to fight for every meter of ground they wanted to claim. The space battle around Earth lasted for 48 hours and became legendary throughout the galaxy because it demonstrated what happened when humans were pushed beyond their breaking point, and instead of collapsing, they became something that even their allies had never seen before, which was a force of nature that could not be stopped or reasoned with or defeated by any conventional means. Alex Turner arrived with his damaged fleet just as the main collective assault force was beginning their final push toward the planet. and he led his ships on a suicide run that broke through enemy lines and created an opening for other human vessels to follow. And even though his ship was destroyed in the attack, his sacrifice inspired hundreds of other captains to make similar desperate moves. The ground fighting on Earth was even more intense than the space battle because collective forces found that humans would not retreat from any position and would fight to the death rather than give up even the smallest piece of their homeworld. And this fanatical resistance slowed the enemy advance to a crawl. Despite their overwhelming technological advantages, President Kate Miller had turned every major city into a massive weapon platform by converting civilian infrastructure into military systems and organizing the population into fighting units that knew every building and every tunnel and every hiding place that could be used to ambush enemy forces and make their occupation as costly as possible. The most amazing moment of the battle came when civilians who had never held weapons before picked up guns from fallen soldiers and continued fighting without any training or preparation because they understood that this was not just about military victory but about the survival of everything that made them human, and they would rather die than lose that. Children who were too young to fight were evacuated to underground shelters, but many teenagers refused to leave and instead joined the resistance groups that were operating behind enemy lines, and their knowledge of the city layouts and tunnel systems proved invaluable for organizing surprise attacks against collective supply lines and communication centers. The Battle of Earth reached its climax when collective forces managed to capture several important government buildings, and it seemed like the planetary defense might finally collapse, but instead of surrendering, the human defenders increased their resistance and began using tactics that were so desperate and violent that even hardened alien warriors were shocked by what they witnessed. Factory workers who had been making weapons for the war effort grabbed the guns they had built and went directly to the front lines without waiting for orders, and office workers who had never seen combat organized themselves into squads that attacked enemy positions with nothing but determination and improvised weapons. The turning point came when a group of human scientists managed to overload the city power grid and create an electromagnetic pulse that disabled most of the collective equipment in the capital region, and this gave the defenders the opportunity they needed to launch a counterattack that drove the invaders back to their landing zones after 48 hours of non-stop fighting. The collective commanders made a decision that shocked their own high command because for the first time in their expansion across the galaxy, they ordered a retreat from a target before it was completely conquered, and this withdrawal was caused not by military defeat but by the realization that conquering Earth would cost more than any victory could be worth. The sight of collective forces retreating from Earth was broadcast across the galaxy, and it marked the moment when every species understood that humanity had become something that had never existed before, which was a people who literally could not be broken no matter what force was used against them. And this revelation changed the entire course of the war. The final battle of the war took place at the Collective Central Hub, which was a massive artificial structure that controlled their entire empire through the quantum network that connected every ship and soldier and base across dozens of star systems. And Admiral Jake Sullivan found himself commanding the largest fleet in galactic history as representatives from 17 different species joined the assault on this ultimate target. Dr. Emma Wright had spent 2 years developing the weapon that would end the war by severing the quantum connections that gave the collective their greatest advantage, and her breakthrough came from studying human brain patterns and discovering that individual consciousness could disrupt hive mind systems if the interference was broadcast at exactly the right frequency and power level. The approach to the central hub required the combined fleet to fight through 7 defensive rings that each contained more firepower than most species had in their entire military, and Jake knew that conventional tactics would never succeed against such overwhelming defenses, but he also knew that humans had taught the galaxy new ways to think about impossible problems. Captain Rob Hayes had been chosen to lead the diplomatic mission that would establish new protocols for species cooperation after the war ended, and he was already working with representatives from dozens of worlds to create agreements based on merit and contribution rather than age or technology level because the war had proven that wisdom and determination were more valuable than advanced science. The battle began with simultaneous attacks on all 7 defensive rings because Jake had learned from human experience that spreading enemy attention across multiple targets was more effective than concentrating force against a single strong point, and this strategy worked so well that 3 of the defensive lines collapsed within hours instead of the days that everyone had expected. Ships from species that had never worked together before were now fighting as unified squadrons because they had learned human methods of cooperation and communication and the sight of former enemies, working side by side to defeat. The collective proved that the war had changed the entire galaxy in ways that would last long after the fighting ended. The most critical moment came when Emma Wright activated her consciousness disruption weapon and aimed it at the central hub quantum transmitters, and for the first time in their history, the collective forces lost their hive mind connection and became individual beings who had to think and act for themselves without the guidance of the central intelligence. Jake watched as collective ships began to drift aimlessly or fire at random targets because their crews had never learned to make decisions without instructions from the hive mind, and this chaos gave the Alliance fleet the opportunity to push through the remaining defenses and reach the central hub itself. The final assault on the hub required boarding parties to fight their way through corridors and chambers that had been designed to be impossible to navigate, but human soldiers led mixed teams of Alliance troops using tactics that combined different species' strengths, and the collective defenders could not adapt fast enough to counter such diverse approaches. Emma Wright was part of the boarding force that reached the central control chamber where the quantum network generators were located, and she personally activated the devices that would permanently sever the connections between all collective facilities and turn their greatest strength into a fatal weakness that would end their empire forever. When the quantum network collapsed, the effect was felt across the entire galaxy as collective forces everywhere suddenly found themselves alone and confused without the hive mind that had guided their every action for thousands of years, and many of them simply stopped fighting because they had no idea what they were supposed to do without central control. The war officially ended 3 weeks later when the last collective strongholds surrendered or were abandoned by forces that could no longer coordinate their defense effectively, and the galaxy began to understand that they had witnessed something that had never happened before, which was the complete transformation of galactic civilization through the influence of a single species. In the aftermath of victory, the Zephyrian Empire offered humanity full membership in their confederation with equal voting rights and shared leadership responsibilities, which was an honor that had never been extended to any species that had achieved spaceflight less than 1,000 years ago, but human contributions to the war had earned them this recognition. Rob Hayes accepted the offer on behalf of Earth, but insisted that the new Galactic Confederation should be open to all species based on their willingness to contribute to mutual defense and cooperation rather than their technology level or the age of their civilization, because the war had proven that determination and creativity were more important than advanced science. The victory celebration on Earth lasted for a week and was attended by representatives from every species that had fought against the collective. But the most important part of the ceremony was when the Galactic Council officially recognized humanity as the species that had taught the galaxy what it meant to be truly unbreakable in the face of any threat. Children on dozens of worlds began learning about the humans who had refused to surrender even when facing impossible odds, and who had found ways to turn defeat into victory through sheer determination and creative thinking. And these lessons became part of the standard education that every young being received, regardless of what planet they came from. Jake Sullivan stood on the bridge of his ship watching Earth rotate peacefully below and reflected on how much had changed since the day when alien ships first appeared in human space, because his people had not only survived the greatest war in galactic history, but had emerged as leaders who would help guide civilization for generations to come. The war had lasted 7 years and cost billions of lives from dozens of species, but it had also created something new in the galaxy, which was a confederation based on cooperation and mutual respect rather than domination and fear, and this transformation had happened because one young species had refused to accept that some battles could not be. One Emma Wright received the highest scientific honor that the galaxy could bestow, and her research into consciousness and quantum mechanics opened new fields of study that would benefit all species for centuries to come. But she always said that her greatest achievement was helping to prove that the power of individual will could overcome any obstacle in the universe. The final entry in the official war history stated that humanity had earned their place in galactic civilization not through superior technology or ancient wisdom, but through their absolute refusal to surrender their freedom and their willingness to sacrifice everything for the principle that some things were worth dying for. And this lesson would be remembered forever.